Welcome to a Celtic State of Mind. This is presented by State of Mind Studios, and I'm here today joined by David Lowe, the chairman of the Celtic Trust. Welcome back, David.
Great to be here. That's quite a few times now.
Well, you're always welcome.
5 times maybe.
I think you're probably, other than myself, next as in appearances.
Wow.
In the appearance list. But the last time you visited us was at Cathkin Park. We spoke a bit about some of the information that you wanted to give to shareholders, and we decided at that time we'll have a follow-up and a Q&A which allows Celtic fans and shareholders to ask questions as we stay online for around 40 to 45 minutes. So I'll keep a wee eye on the questions coming in here, David, and you and I will discuss the situation until these questions come in. So our last podcast that we did was very popular. I think Celtic fans obviously are looking at the situation as shareholders and they want to know more. So could you just give us a summary of what we discussed the last time you were on the podcast?
Well, basically the problem we've got as Celtic shareholders is that over the course of time, more and more shareholders have become detached from their shareholdings. It's 26 years, since the first share issue, 1994, and over that period of time, a lot of people have died. Shareholders have died, unfortunately. A lot of people have moved home, sometimes more than once. And given the fact that Celtic shares are probably the only share that a lot of these supporters will have bought, they're not really au fait or cognizant with all the protocols, rules, regulations. And over the course of time, they have not been able to update the share register. So they're not receiving a report and accounts. They're not having the ability to attend AGMs. In some cases, they're not receiving their dividends. And basically, it has allowed those that still vote to concentrate, power in the hands of fewer and fewer over the years. So it's not a healthy thing. It's not limited to Celtic. It's common in all companies. All publicly listed companies with a diverse shareholder base have the same problem. But in Celtic's instance, we have got over 25,000 different shareholdings, and the numbers are large and growing. So what the Celtic Trust is endeavouring to do is to stop this from happening and to reunite shareholders with their shares, their dividends and their votes. That's basically the end game here. And it appears to be working because all the Celtic Trust numbers, membership numbers have gone up. So this is a good thing.
Absolutely. Now, David, when we spoke the last time, obviously, as often happens on a Celtic State of Mind, you get a lot of feedback and then people have differing views and ideas as to what the motive is. And I just want to make clear what the Celtic Trust motive and what your motive is for coming back on today to open up a discussion and engage with any Celtic supporters, shareholders or not.
Well, first of all, shareholders, in the eyes of the law, do own the club. And every shareholder is as important and is as equal as the other. So whether you're the largest shareholder or whether you're the smallest shareholder, you are a part owner of Celtic and you should have a say in the affairs of Celtic. And as I said, over the years, that objective's been sort of reduced because people are unfamiliar with the terrain, so to speak. So all we're trying to do is reunite Celtic shareholders with their shares, their votes and their dividends. So that's a good thing, and nobody of sound mind could suggest otherwise. I was asked to get involved. I'm very happy to get involved. It's a subject that I know about. Everybody that's at the Celtic Trust, all the trustees, are volunteers. There's no big money thing going on here. It's a service that's available to Celtic shareholders. So it's a good thing.
Absolutely. Now, with regards to the club then, David, you're working quite closely with them to try and re-establish that engagement with the shareholders, aren't you?
Yes, we've spoken to Celtic, and Celtic share these objectives. Celtic want to happen what is happening, and we will be working with Celtic to reunite shareholders with their shares, so no problems there. Perhaps Celtic should have addressed it earlier. That's the furthest they'll go towards criticising the club. It shouldn't really have got as bad as it is, but the problem has been recognised, and there is now a plan working with Celtic to remedy the problem.
David, we're doing this live to allow Celtic fans and shareholders to ask you questions directly. It's basically using the platform so that engagement can be as open and transparent as possible. We did the podcast. It's a pre-recorded podcast that goes out as a message. People can then comment on that on social media and the like. But this is an opportunity today, and we're going to be online for 45 minutes for Celtic fans to ask questions on Facebook. So just watch the video and comment with your questions, and I will pose them to David here. In the meantime, you and I will discuss various other things, because obviously we both like a chat about Celtic and football and various other matters. You came to my attention as a 34-year-old. Was it 34?
You're talking about the Celtic takeover?
Yeah.
A generation ago. Something like that. I'm not sure what age I was, but it was the early 30s anyway.
But prior to that, and what I found quite interesting, being a big music fan myself, is that prior to that you were involved in managing bands. Yeah,
in the 1980s I had a very good 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite an ebullient time for business, stock markets, etc. So I found myself having done pretty well out of the financial system, and I was working in a big merchant bank, and my career would have involved, working in New York or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided I was in the fortunate situation whereby I could opt out. So I was living in Edinburgh at the time, and I made the decision to opt out of the greasy pole and to move back to Glasgow, to go self-employed in the middle of a recession. And I decided when I did that all I would only do things that I enjoyed. And the things that I enjoyed was music and football.
Mm-hmm.
So I got involved in the music business with a recording studio and bands, etc., financial advice, and just having a good time, etc. And that's something I enjoyed. Also, the football thing is something that, from previous podcasts that I've done is very important. I just love sport, love football, love Celtic. So, and I love financial matters. So I think I said in the previous podcast that I did notice that Celtic were falling further and further behind Rangers in the 1980s. The game had changed in the 1980s. Debt was interest to football for the first time. Right up to the mid-80s, there was a level financial playing field.
Mm-hmm.
There was no bank debt, and you were as good as the size of your crowd, your manager, and the number of people that watched you. So that's why you had a competitive Scottish Football League. Rangers in the mid-80s were the fourth best team in Scotland. Everybody forgets that, behind Celtic and the new firm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons Rangers were taken over, because they were in such a poor position. David Murray came in a few years later and then went crazy with all the debt. So it happened. Celtic had a very bad board at the time. They were inexperienced. They didn't see it happening. And they were just falling further and further behind. So my view was, well, that's not right. I'm not having that. I'm going to try and do something about that. And that was the genesis for all that Celtic takeover stuff. It really started 5 years before.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't the only guy that thought that. Fergus McCann was on the scene, as were other businessmen. But basically, the game changed when debt was introduced to the Scottish game. And again, I was allowed to get involved in football, finance, etc., because that's something that's right up my street. So the music and the football took me into the 1990s, and then the Celtic takeover came along, and that lasted 2 years. So that was great fun. A great satisfaction to be had out of the end result.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I was surprised, I think, the last time you were in, off camera, we were discussing how long you stayed at Celtic after that, because I just took it for granted. After the takeover, you probably moved into other areas and done your own thing. How long were you actually still involved with the club?
Well, I was there certainly the whole time Fergus was there. So, and it was a very tough time. Everybody forgets. Everybody looks back in Fergus's 5 years at Celtic with rose-tinted glasses, but it was really torrid. It was really difficult. Fans were howling at the moon, and give him the money, give Di Canio the money, give them all the money. Didn't have the money. That's what got, say, Celtic and Rangers subsequently into trouble, spending money they didn't have. So, when Rangers were at 7 in a row, everybody was nervous. When Rangers were at 8 in a row, everybody was more nervous. And by the time it got to 10, everybody's just screaming, give them all the money, whatever they want, So, but you can't do that. So one of the things I had to do was go and do all these road shows all over the world, quite frankly, and sort of preach the gospel. We can only be as good as we can. We're not going to pay out money we don't have, because we'll go bust if we do that. And it was a tough gig, but I'm quite like all that confrontational stuff. I don't mind standing up and arguing with fans if I think what we're arguing is correct. So I was around doing that for 5 years behind the scenes, and that continued for a few years after that. But it got boring. It's very difficult to enjoy supporting Celtic if you're working in and around the Celtic scene. You're not really just looking at Celtic through the prism of a game and a result. There's a whole lot of extraneous factors going on. And I don't think it was a particularly joyful period when I was there. So I made the decision when Alan MacDonald left. And I think that was around 2000. And that guy McLeod came in, and I thought, this guy hasn't a clue. And I'm out. I've had enough of this. I'm just going to go back to a normal seat and enjoy myself. And turn up in jeans and get pissed.
And enjoy it, that's the thing.
Enjoy it,
I mean, see, when you have a passion, as you say, you take it, the conflict that you say that may have happened when you're doing the roadshow, but you also appreciate that that's because the Celtic fans were so frustrated, and there was a lot of passion. Passion was running high at that time. Signed Di Canio, given the money, etc., etc. That happened. Yeah. And I think the budget, I had a very interesting discussion yesterday. It was on the podcast last night about the budget that perhaps the manager had season on season. It was never going to be huge until Celtic finished the stadium and got everything else in order, was it?
Yeah, so when the club was taken over in 1994, it was a hell of a mess. It was insolvent, and it was going bust, and there was debt. But crucially, it did not have a stadium. There's a thing called the Taylor Report. A lot of younger fans have probably forgotten that. After the Hillsborough disaster and maybe the Bradford fire, and there was a big fire in Bradford's ground, the Conservative government said that all stadia have to be seated, and no standing at all. So Rangers, by accident or design, had an all-seater stadium. Celtic didn't. Celtic had 8,000 seats in the main stand, and the rest was terracing. So the board hadn't done anything about this. The board didn't have the money to do anything about it. The board thought they were Celtic, and we had to, or the boards, Fergus, had to address this very quickly. Otherwise, we would have been playing in front of 8,000 fans, or maybe benching seats, etc., on the cheap. So,
which was probably what the board were planning after everything else fell.
Yeah, I know the board was planning that, and I know other people trying to take over the club were planning something similar, doing it on the cheap. But, we're a big club, and we're a professional club, and, we aspire to achieve big things. You've got to do things properly. So, and there was a big debate, indeed, whether Celtic should stay at Celtic Park or go to Cambuslang or go to some Rob Royston or somewhere else more exotic. But Fergus was of the view, we should stay at Celtic Park, and we should rebuild Celtic Park. And if you build the stadium, the people will come. And that's what he and the board did. So we built 60,000 seats, and I think it took 4 seasons. Might be wrong, 4 seasons to build. But whilst that stadium was getting built, remember that was soaking up a significant proportion of Celtic's cash flow. So for every pound you put into a stadium, which you have to, because you can't not, you're going to have less money for the squad.
Yeah.
So until that stadium was paid for. You then factor into account that the guy across the street or on the other side of the city is spending money he doesn't earn or doesn't own. So basically you've got two polarities. You've got a very expensive Rangers squad, and money tends to buy you better players, and better players and more money tends to buy you results. So that's what they were doing. It was unsustainable, but that's what they were doing, and it was becoming very nervous to Celtic fans because Rangers were at 7 and Rangers were at 8. But whilst we were building that stadium, we didn't have access to that the right level of money for the squad. Also, remember, it was a stand at the time, so the gates were like 30,000.
Yeah.
And we were at Hampden for a year, and they asked for a pound of flesh. You know, they really knew that Celtic didn't have an option. The SFA, I'm no fan of the SFA. They've never done Celtic any good turn. But they asked for their pound of flesh when we were at Hampden, and they got it because we had no options. So it was a tough gig for Celtic trying to compete with Rangers, getting nearer and nearer this magical 9-10. And Celtic fans then were as crazy as, if that's the correct word, as Rangers fans now. But again, the view of the board, the view of Fergus, the view of me is you should concentrate on your own. You should be the best you can be, and that's what Celtic focused on. You can't really worry about what the other opposition is going to do. You can just focus on your own team, your own squad, and be the best you can be. It was true then, and it's true now.
You mentioned there the season at Hampden, David, and I remember it well. I do remember it quite. When I look back on it, it's a wee bit different because if you've maybe been a season ticket holder for a period of time, that was my first season ticket.
Yeah.
So I always look quite fondly back on the season, even though the football on the pitch wasn't great. But we did get the trophy, we did win the Scottish Cup. But I've since read, I think the quote from Fergus McCann is that the SFA were mean-spirited in a lot of what they did to Celtic during that campaign. And one of the things that I found very interesting was the argument of the Irish tricolour not flying at Hampden. Was that something that was stipulated to Celtic when we played there for a year, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole list of conditions, to do with who has ownership of the discretionary spend. That's basically your pies and your bovril. These are the conditions: you must not fly, the Irish flag. So, that these stories are all true.
And that's only 1994.
I don't really want to go into them, but it's still a provocative flag for a lot of the indigenous establishment types that still permeate Scottish football and other parts of Scottish society. It's a problem then, and it's a problem now. I suspect it'll be a problem for a considerable time to come. But it's true.
Oh, wow. See, when you look at that stadium that was obviously, it rose like a phoenix from the flames, was it everything that you envisaged? Was there anything else that you maybe think we should have done it this way or that way?
No, I mean, it's a fantastic stadium. The three sides were built. It's still basically the original main stand. Every now and again, a discussion crops up about whether you should complete the donut or whatever you want to call it by increasing the capacity to 70,000 in the main stand. But I think given where we are in the Scottish game, Scottish leagues, I think 60,000 is enough. And again, if we were to start a major construction project, that's diverting money from the team, and then there's also the hotel and there's also the museum. At the end of the day, it's all about balance and priority. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be, wanting to increase the capacity to 70,000. Well,
I mean, obviously, Fergus had the foresight building a 60,000-seater stadium, David, when we were averaging probably in the 30s in terms of an average crowd. How often would it actually sell out if it was to go up to 75,000, 80,000? That would be the question, wouldn't it?
We don't know. I mean, as recently as the Ronnie Dyla years, it wasn't full. But you're right up until the early 90s, Celtic's average crowds were comfortably in the 30s. There is a consistency that goes right back to the post-war years. Mm-hmm. Even when we were winning 9 in a row in the 1960s and 70s, the crowds actually started to tail off the more leagues we won because it was becoming a bit boring, I would imagine. So you got to use actually a David Murray phrase. You got to keep changing the menu. If it's the same players consistently winning the league, for some, because you got a hardcore of Celtic fans, and the hardcore are those that just buy season tickets in and out. But there is a sort of less hardcore is the phrase I'll use, that can take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And I'm no going back type of guy or girl. And there's quite a lot of them. Gordon Strachan is a very successful Celtic manager, but a lot of people didn't go because they didn't like his football. Ronnie Dyler as well, manager of New York City MLS team, a very good guy, very nice guy, but he didn't captivate fans the way that the Magnificent Lenny does. So
the Magnificent Lenny, I would call him that as well. I thought you were going to say the Magnificent Brendan Rodgers there, David, which was probably his own description of himself.
We won't mention people like him.
His name keeps coming up. We've got a couple of questions. We'll start off with one regarding the Celtic Trust, which is why we're here, but obviously we'll continue to speak about Celtic in the interim period. Kevin Graham wants to know, how are the Trust going to go about getting more interest, because he believes that previously they may not have had that kind of engagement with the shareholders or the fans.
Well, it's difficult. If your team's doing well, there's less to complain about, there's less to moan about, there's less reason to join organisations if you're just getting the results you want. So the Celtic Trust has been around since 1990, and we have had, by and large, a very good 20 years since then. Very little to complain about. So that's why when things are going well, there's not really that much need to do too much. However, I think it's clear now that this ownership question is very, very important. There is a raison d'etre now for the Celtic Trust. Celtic Trust is a shareholder society. The Celtic Trust is doing something about the share problem, and it is a problem. And what we're doing is reuniting Celtic shareholders with their shares, their dividends and their votes. And as I keep saying, this is a good thing. It's right up the Celtic Trust street. It's why it exists, and we are helping achieve this fan objective. The Celtic Trust also owns Celtic shares. The more memberships there are in the Celtic Trust, the stronger the cash flow is. That cash flow is used to buy shares. So the more members there are, the better. The more cash there is to buy shares, and the more fans will have a say in the affairs of the club. And that's a good thing as well. It's very easy when you're in a ivory tower boardroom to be detached and remote. I'm not saying this is the case. It's very easy for that to become the case. And I basically see the Celtic Trust as a fans representative organisation that can help keep the board in touch with the views of fans. There are very many other issues that the Celtic Trust can become involved in, but this share thing is the biggest one by far. There are things like, for example, and these are just random examples, the prospectus from 1994 afforded a 10% discount in the Celtic stores to shareholders. That's still a live offer, but it's not really used. It's sort of been forgot about by everybody, including Celtic. So that's something that the Trust could get involved with in due course. There's also, these fan areas that are developing around Britain. I was in Anfield last year for the first time in 20 years or so, and I was amazed at how good it looks. Last time I was there, it was a bit of a kind of think of the polite word, but we need if there's going to be fan zones, you need toilets for fans. You can't go into Celtic Park and come back out just to use the toilet. It might seem not very important, but it is important. A lot of even since I was a kid, fans congregate outside grounds, talk before they go in, and everybody rushes in the last 5 minutes. Well, Celtic are trying to develop, as all clubs are, fan zones. And you have to have facilities. You can't just sell them food and drink and cross your legs for half an hour until you get into the ground. So things like that, we can work with. And there's a whole lot of other things I can't remember.
Well, I think one of the ones during the season that there was a few protests from fan groups, including the boys, who I think are a kind of splinter, separate group from the Green Brigade, David, and they were really pushing the 20s Plenty campaign, which was, as it says, they were looking for £20 for away games, for away tickets for all clubs. So, clubs coming to Celtic Park would also spend £20 to get their ticket.
Yeah, well, again, the Trust is generally supportive of that principle. However, enforcement is an issue. Getting all the clubs to agree to 20's plenty for away fans is a very difficult thing to achieve. It is something that the Trust generally supports, but it's been basically overtaken by this issue, the share issue, which is a big issue. But that's a good example of another issue. Another factor that's relevant, is if it has an effect on clubs' revenues, you have less money to buy good players, because you can't have it both ways. We'd all like into the ground for a tenner, but if Celtic's revenues went away down, they wouldn't be able to afford the same calibre of players that they have just now. So it's all relative, but it's a good cause. More so in the environment that we find ourselves in. I'm talking about the virus. I'm talking about the recession that's coming around the corner. There's going to be a lot of people with a lot less money, and there's going to be less discretionary spend. So it's a very live issue, and we'll get round to dealing with that as well at some point.
You brought up COVID. It's obviously been on everybody's minds for several months now, David, and it's great to know that you're keeping well and we can meet up in person in the confines of the studio. But there is a question here from Lawrence Connolly coming through on Facebook, and can I remind everyone that you can comment on Facebook? I will ask David your questions on your behalf. We're here to speak about the issues that we raised the last time in relation to Celtic shareholders and what the Celtic Trust are doing to build bridges, engage with the club, engage with you as shareholders and fans. So please keep the questions coming in. But Lawrence Connolly wants to know is how well are Celtic placed to weather COVID? How does this compare to other UK teams?
Well, first of all, Celtic are very well placed, let's be clear about that, because they have a strong balance sheet, i.e. they have money in the bank. And that's the most important thing of all. Whether you're a football club or whether you're a business or whether you're a household or whether you're an individual, your ability to withstand what's going on is very seriously affected by whether you've got any savings or not and your ability to borrow money. So we're in a really tough time. It's a horrible time. Celtic are in a very strong position to see it through, but this can't go on forever. And what I mean by that, I mean that we can't all be buying season tickets for games we're not going to be seeing forever. So it's a time of great uncertainty, but Celtic fans have bought out their season tickets, all sold out. I think there's still a waiting list. All the executive facilities are all sold out. Celtic are good for this season, and who knows beyond the season after that, because we don't know what the situation is with the virus. So we're in a very strong situation. I maybe mention at this point, without crowing, Celtic are genuinely in a financial league of their own. They have been very well managed, and the board does need credit for that. But we need a league to play in. There's no point being the wealthiest team in the world or the wealthiest team in Scotland if you've nobody left to play because they've gone bust. So, and it's a bit like a boxing analogy. A heavyweight's not going to spar against a bantamweight. He has to spar against a heavyweight. We don't have any heavyweight opposition anymore. Rangers don't have the financial resources that we have. Again, a matter of fact, not a matter of crowing. And everybody else is materially, financially smaller than that. So I think this is a major problem, for Celtic in the long run, because it's easy for our standards to fall to the mean, the average, than it is for the rest to get to Celtic's level. That's not going to happen. And I include Rangers in that. So it's not it's unhealthy to keep up, and it's difficult to keep up a very high standard if you sort of know that if you play to your capability, you're going to win the game. So it's very easy psychologically to sort of take your foot off the gas and for an opposition team to sneak a result. So I think complacency is the danger for Celtic. But by and large, we are very financially strong. We can see this through as long as it doesn't last forever. But we need a league to play in, and I think that's the issue. It's unclear whether, for me anyway, whether the teams that are in the league have the financial strength to see out the season if they don't have the same level of money coming in as they have had previous seasons. So it's worrying, and there's no definite answer to this problem.
Absolutely. A very interesting interview was had yesterday, and as I say, it went out last night, David. So for anyone who's not listened to it, please do listen to the podcast with Paul Smith that went out last night, not the designer. But Paul worked quite closely with Fergus during Fergus's time at Celtic. Yeah. So we had a very interesting discussion about the efforts to try and move away from Scottish football back in Fergus's time. Yeah. And there was the mooted purchase of Wimbledon Football Club at that time. So obviously Fergus knew back then that the future wasn't going to be in Scottish football. And as you say, we're more or less, the domination of Celtic. As a fan, I still see us as potentially a European class club. I know that you would think the same. Business then comes into play and you think, well, in Scotland it's not going to happen. How involved were you in any discussions or any plans for the move to buy Wimbledon?
Yeah, well, again, I can talk about that. It's probably out of the statute of limitations. So, I mean, and I keep mentioning my friend that sits next to me in the main stand, Peter Riley's, he's 80. And I keep saying Peter tells you how awful Celtic were prior to Jock Stein, which is true, and we all know that. So why do I say that? So people of my age, or around my age, have only ever known good times. I come in when Jock Stein came in, and I've only ever knew Celtic as a team that won the league year in, year out. I'm talking about as a kid and as a teenager, and regularly played in the latter stages of Europe's biggest competition. So for somebody of my age, this is the Celtic that I know. This is the Celtic that I want to see. I don't want to see a Celtic that wins the Scottish League year in, year out, then gets knocked out by a small team. And small teams have big television revenues, and I can think of lots of them that are not nearly the type of world team that Celtic are. So my aspirations for Celtic are to see Celtic competing, with the biggest and the best in Europe's top competition. And there's lots of other people of the same age that have the similar outlook and similar aspiration. And again, the board are all of an age as well that presumably they share that view. But it's very difficult to achieve when you're the biggest fish in a small financial pond. It allows mediocre teams with mediocre fan bases to basically outspend you for the best players because they have access to the TV revenues. So this became a growing problem in the 1990s, and it's basically continued right up to this point in time. And I will get round to answering your question, but the context is quite important. The background is quite important. So COVID is a game changer. I'm not talking about we all know how bad it is for health and families and deaths, and that's a given. But it's also creating conditions for change. And I do believe that all the television contracts, the gerrymandering, the geo-blocking is going to be contested. I don't think the delivery of the end product, the television broadcast monies, are going to be happening in the same way that they have done in the last 20 years. Younger generations are not sitting in front of a big screen in the corner of the room. It is via devices, portable devices, phones, iPads, tablets, etc. This is the way to go, and I think all the geo-blocking and gerrymandering of TV rights is going to be contested. I think league structures, this is the key point, before I come on to the Wimbledon and Clyde Bank, which I was an owner of briefly in the 1990s, late 90s. So, league structures, the menu, I used the phrase earlier on, changing the menu. The menu is boring now for more and more people. They're fed up watching your Chelseas and your Italian teams, etc., playing each other umpteen times. So I think there's going to be change there as well, jurisdictional change, and there's already discussions taking place about cross-border league competitions. And even before the virus, there was reasonably advanced talks and indeed the heads of terms about the Belgian league and the Dutch league merging. So that was real in February. Heads of terms signed, real discussions taking place. And that's a good example of the type of change that I think can be extrapolated throughout Europe. So coming on to Celtic being the big fish in the small pond and stuck with a football jurisdiction that we didn't then and we don't now, me personally now, have much confidence in. There was a lot of focus went into looking at the league rules structures. And it is true to say that prior to the World Cup, I've got my timeline right now, in 1998, it was possible for a team competing in a football league jurisdiction to actually play in the jurisdiction of another country. That was possible. It was possible for Celtic to play in England. That's a fact. However, what are you going to do? So one of the things you could do was to buy a club and rebrand it. Now, this is a controversial subject because it affects fans of the club that's getting rebranded.
Yeah.
It's quite American, it's like the New York Dodgers moving to LA in the 40s or 50s. Basically, if you're a New York Dodgers fan, what are you going to do? You're not going to travel to LA. So it's a hot toddy subject. But basically, Wimbledon were a relatively new member of what was then the Football League. They played out of Plough Lane in Wimbledon, which is a small stadium, which was perfectly adequate for what was then the 4th division. But they did very well, and they sailed up through the divisions with a very, very small fan base. Mm-hmm. And I think they got to the FA Cup final, beaten by Liverpool. I might be wrong there. And to cut a long story short, the two guys that owned it wanted to sell it. And I think they wanted to sell it for like £40 million.
Right.
So it was possible, and they would sell it to anybody. I think they sold it to a businessman in Milton Keynes, and it's now called MK Dons, and the Wimbledon they now know as like a new club. Mm-hmm. So basically, it was in the 1990s possible for Celtic to buy Wimbledon, change its name to Celtic, change its colours to green and white hoops, and change its registered ground to Celtic Park. And hey presto, for a price of £40 million, you have Celtic playing in the Championship, as it would have been at the time, because it had been relegated. So that worked. Per all the rules in existence at the time. But football is a funny thing, because what happens is, or like any private members organisation, SFA, SPFL and their contemporaries, if they don't like a rule, they just change it. Mm-hmm. So just because it was within the rules at the time, they could just as easily change it to stop it happening. Because the fear that the football authorities have is that it opens up a Pandora's box. If Celtic, and this comes back to what I was originally saying, if Celtic, are playing have a jurisdiction, it's the SFA, and if the biggest club on the SFA's patch, look at it that way, is playing in some other dude's jurisdiction in England, that's not good for the SFA. So they don't want it. They didn't want it, and the UEFA didn't want it because it would open the Pandora's box to what? Porto playing in La Liga or Ajax playing in the Bundesliga. Where does it stop, and what does it mean for national teams? So that was possible then. Anyway, myself and some other guys, and this is relevant, at the same time, bought Clyde Bank, which was in a similar situation to Wimbledon, in that Clyde Bank had only been in the league since 1966. Mm-hmm. And it came into the league in very controversial circumstances. There is an irony here. When Clyde Bank was originally East Stirling, or East Stirlingshire, I want to give it the correct name, playing out of Falkirk. And in 1965, might be some people listening to this, correct me if I get my dates wrong, but basically they rebranded as Clyde Bank along the lines I just mentioned there, changed the ground, changed the strip, changed the name, and it all ended up in court, and basically East Stirlingshire were reinstated, and a new, to use the American phrase, franchise was awarded to Clyde Bank, and Clyde Bank joined the league proper in 1966 and continued along the way and right up until the 1990s. But the Steedmans wanted out, and we gave them some money for it. And they were like Wimbledon in respect that they had very low fan base. The Steedmans had sold the ground, and they Kilbowie, and they were nomads. I think they were playing in Greenock at some times, and they were playing in one of the other clubs up the Clyde. So no fans, no ground. Sorry, not no fans, few fans. So we basically bought it and moved it to Dublin.
Right.
And we had basically hired the Royal Dublin Showground in Ballsbridge. And the idea was that the club would relocate to the fourth largest city in the British Isles. And Ireland is in the British Isles. It's not a political statement. It's part of the British Isles, as is other islands in the British Isles. Anyway, the idea was that it would rebrand as Dublin City. It would change its colours to Dublin sky blue, and it would play out of Ballsbridge, and it had like £20 million worth of new investment get into it. Mm-hmm. And the logic was that what that did was create a sort of Celtic League of a fashion, in that having the fourth largest city, Dublin, in the Scottish Football League is a great thing. That's like bringing a city the size of Glasgow to the Scottish Football League, and with all the sponsorship and television opportunities that represented, it basically doubled the market size of the Scottish game by taking Ireland into a Celtic League of a fashion. But what you tend to find is that the SFA, whenever you come up with good innovative ideas, that they don't like it, and they'll try and stop it. So what actually happened, and it was within all the rules, and of course what it was also was a Trojan horse for Celtic.
Yeah.
If Clyde Bank can move to Dublin,
mm-hmm.
Certainly Celtic can take over Wimbledon and relocate to Glasgow. So, and saying all of this, I'm not disputing the fact that it's controversial, there's casualties, and even amongst the Celtic support, you have a variety of different views. There is a camaraderie or a comradeship amongst football fans. What about the fans of Wimbledon? What about the fans of Clyde Bank? And I get that, but I'm interested in what's best for Celtic,
mm-hmm.
always have done. And I can be pretty uncompromising, in that respect. And Clyde Bank moving to Dublin would open the door for Wimbledon moving to Glasgow. Anyway, so what happened is they're all sitting down going, it was Ollie Byrne, the Irish Jim Farry at the time, were saying they can't do this, they can't do this. Then they get the lawyers involved, and the lawyers were saying, they can. What are we going to do about it? We're going to change the rules. So what they actually did is, before the 1998 World Cup, there's a thing called a plenary, and that's where all the football authorities get together and they changed rules and all that. So what they did was they changed the rules to prevent this, and they introduced a rule called, which basically said, if my memory is correct, the only occasion in which a football club based in a jurisdiction with a football league can play in another jurisdiction with a football league is if it's in a trans-border geographic region not separated by a mountain range. Right? So, Glasgow's nowhere near the border.
Mm-hmm.
Berwick Rangers, which was in the SFL at the time, is right on the border, not separated by a mountain range. So they're cool. Monaco's cool in France. Singapore, I think, played in the Malaysian league or something. And then everybody went on about the Welsh leagues. But what they basically did was introduce a rule to stop a good thing happening. And that good thing, for me anyway, would have resulted in Celtic playing in the English Championship with everything that meant, with a good prospect of getting promoted to what's now called the Premiership, and the rest would have been history. We'd have won the Champions League 3 times in a row, wouldn't we?
Well, when you're looking at the possibilities, moving into the land of the riches, and obviously we give Fergus a huge amount of credit on a Celtic State of Mind, but for him to also be supportive of that move shows that a bit of foresight in Fergus's mind as well, David.
Yeah, he was into that then, as were the board. Fergus gets a lot of credit, and deservedly so, but he had a very strong board. Everybody forgets that. Fergus and Brian Quinn, like 2 very good chairmen, the best we've had. But the board is the focus at the time was basically building that. When Fergus was there, the 5 years, building the stadium, getting it paid for, and it was always going to be the case that as soon as that thing was paid for, suddenly the amount of money available for the squad he would have increased dramatically, which it did. But again, we were always living within our means. So even if we could, and I'm just making the numbers up, double the size of our squad, you've got a guy across the street that's just borrowing money who'll treble it, and he did say, or quadruple it, for every $5 they spend, I'll spend a tenner. Well, that was stupid then, and it's stupid now, and of course they ended up getting liquidated. But the challenge, your original question was, this nirvana, holy grail of playing in a bigger jurisdiction with big money and against the big teams and getting into the Champions League latter stages. I don't believe that can happen unless there's a change in the dynamic. It was attempted or considered in the 1990s, and it's been considered on and off ever since, quite frankly. I don't think there's a night that, not literally, Peter Lawwell doesn't think, how do we get out of this? How do we get into a better jurisdiction, given the fact that we're such a big fish in a small pond? It's the Gordian knot that's still to be cut, Herculean task. And I think it will happen. And maybe COVID will be the catalyst, as I said, with the geo-blocking and the gerrymandering of the leagues and the television. I think it'll all come down. I think the Belgian and the Dutch discussions are a good opening to that possibility.
Well, that answers one of the questions that we got. Thank you to Lawrence Conley for asking that. Is COVID going to be that route out to Scottish football? So I think you've answered that perfectly well. Please keep coming in with the questions for David Lowe, who is here to represent the Celtic Trust as the chairman. We are deviating a wee bit and speaking about Celtic and music and anything else that we care to discuss in between the questions coming through. But I must thank Stephen McComiskey, who's asking, is there any idea when the fans will be allowed back into the stadium, and are Celtic putting plans in place for this? Now, obviously, David, you're not employed by Celtic, so you can't talk for the club, but in your view, when do you think we can see fans back in?
Well, who knows? I don't think anybody knows, but ultimately it's a government decision. It's not the decision of the SFA or the SPFL. It's when the government says it's safe to do it. And we have a very conservative small C government in this country. So who knows? Is there going to be another spike? Who knows? Everybody's talking about that. I'm hearing talk of the possibility of it happening in September, October, but that's just rumour. I mean, I wouldn't attach any great credence to that. Nobody knows, so there's no answer.
Yeah. Now, again, deviating slightly, we had a fantastic suggestion during the week there, David, about generating cash at football stadiums, and it comes back to your point about fan zones as well. We were talking about the reintroduction of alcohol sales within football grounds in Scotland, because obviously that it is available elsewhere in other sports. Yeah. And the COVID thing bringing down barriers, etc., people may be looking at other ways to generate income. Yeah. And the suggestion was that everybody that's in the stadium's a season ticket holder, virtually, and with your card you can get 3 drinks. Yeah. Do you think that would work? Do you think there's a time in the future where, responsible adults like you and I can go to a game and have a couple of beers?
I think you can. I mean, it happens in England. I work in London a lot, and I go to English grounds a lot, and you can get. Liverpool is a good example, distinct from London. Basically, you can stand in the concourse there and have all kinds of exotic food and alcohol. And I'm not just talking about bulk standard horrible pint. I'm talking about your fancy beers, and it is beers and cider rather than the spirits. But I don't see why not. I don't see why in this day and age our fans, should not be able to have a beer and some decent food. I mean, food is important as well. It's why do people buy pies and stuff like that? You don't go to the supermarket and buy a pie, but you will when you're at a football game. It's a bit weird,
How much has it changed really since the 1950s? The diet?
Well, the diet hasn't, and maybe the alcohol problem hasn't. I mean, who knows? At the end of the day, this alcohol issue is a government issue. But our board is very progressive. Our Celtic board, I sound like a board acolyte now, I don't mean to be. But basically, we have got the standing section, which is a great thing. Mm-hmm. Celtic made that happen. When it comes to alcohol, that's a government decision. You can do it at rugby. You can do it other sports. Why can't you do it in football? Football fans are not getting treated properly here. It's not right.
No, absolutely. There's another question, and I think you've certainly touched on this with the Belgium-Holland discussion. This is coming in, thank you very much, from Tam Mannion. What are the prospects for the Atlantic League discussions starting again, and do you think it's worth pursuing? I think from what you've said, you would look elsewhere. You certainly would feel that that's worth pursuing.
Fans, if you get 10 fans in a room, you might get 10 different views. I'm not. Alan MacDonald, who was the chief executive who came in 1999 when Fergus left, was very committed to the Atlantic League, and I can't even remember who was in it. I think it might have been the Scandinavian teams. So if you want Celtic to play in a different league, what is that construct that you want? Is it a Scandinavian league, or is it Belgium and Denmark, for example, or Holland? These are similarly sized leagues. The Scottish League is still a very big league. You've got your Big Five, then you've got the English Championship, which is the sixth largest league, last time I looked anyway, the sixth largest league in the world. But then just below that, bubbling under, you've got Holland, Scotland and Portugal, are all much of a muchness. So what league, whether it's the Atlantic League, use that as a moniker, whether it's the Atlantic League or some other league, is that better than the current league? And you get different views amongst different fans. Why couldn't Celtic, for example, play with Trapdoors in and ups? It's not just an exclusive club. Celtic are saying bye-bye to exclusive league. Sorry, Celtic are saying bye-bye to Scotland. It's like there's a trapdoor in and out, up and down. So would Celtic fit into a Dutch stroke Belgian league? Would they want to? Would the fans accept that, want it? Or would some fans say, no, I'm not having that? You don't know unless you try it. But I think Celtic playing in a Dutch Belgium league is an attractive proposition, and maybe more attractive than the Scandinavian version. But it's still not as good as a big, the Big Five league. I personally would rather play in the English league. Always have done. Always have thought that, and I still think that, and I still think that's possible. The question was about COVID. This is something that we've not. This is a major disruption of a size we've not experienced since the Second World War. Everything is up for grabs. Everything. The television construct is up for grabs. I think that will change with technology, geo-blocking. I think that's all going. I think your Amazons and your Facebooks, could be bidding for sports rights rather than the usual people. And I think jurisdictions are all up for grabs because clubs will go bust. And big football clubs need leagues to play in. And I think Celtic are a welcome addition as a global brand. It's a well-managed brand. We're an addition to somebody's league. We don't have any baggage, so we're an attractive proposition for another league. And I think if there is going to be a change, I think it's going to be in the next few years or so, rather than at some indeterminate point in the future.
Now, David, we have joined together today to speak about the Celtic Trust and speak about the shareholdings and the issues that you have raised, and to try and engage with Celtic supporters and shareholders. And it's something that you are welcome to come and do at any time within the studio, and we'll put it out live so people can engage with you. We'll give the platform so that throughout this process, you can engage with the fans directly, because it's difficult when we can't have a live event, for example, and a Q&A, but we can certainly do it online. Whilst we've been speaking, the name Fergus McCann always comes up when people speak about David Lowe. Of course it does. We're working together during that takeover and what happened thereafter. As a football fan, I look at the 3 managerial appointments made under Fergus's time at Celtic Park. You've got Tommy Burns, and you've got Wim Jansen and Joe Venglos.
Yeah.
Who else? What other names did Fergus fancy during that period?
Well, Tommy Burns was always really the guy that was wanted when, as Fergus would call him, Luigi Macari, get sacked. He was still young. He was full of enthusiasm. He was a big Celtic fan, as everybody knows, and he had some management experience at Kilmarnock, and there was a wee bit of controversy at the time as to whether he was tapped up or not. I think Celtic get fines, but that's neither here nor there. At the end of the day, it was always going to be a tough gig for whoever that manager was coming in, because Rangers had more money, borrowing more money, didn't have the stadium. So, I thought it was always going to be extremely unlikely that Celtic could win the league in 95-6, 4-5-5-6, maybe even 6-7, but we were capable of, probably later on. Tommy was always thereabouts. I can't remember the other names, it's so long ago, but I think he was right up there from the outset.
Mm-hmm.
It was a difficult relationship. I mean, again, business people and football people. Football's a very strange world. It's very herd-like. Everybody's very set in their ways. It's very conservative. It's not like any other business. As Anne Budge was finding out, as successive as Jackie Lowe at Partick Thistle's finding out. I mean, you've got to play the game even when the game's a bit crazy. It's not like normal business. And a lot of American owners have found out that football is the easiest way in the world to lose a whole lot of money. Basically, Fergus and the board knew what was required here and had to be really tight and disciplined in pursuit of that objective. There was always going to be conflict, with the football department, if you want to call it that. And Tommy Burns was in perennial conflict with Fergus and the board, and ultimately the parted ways. Wim Jansen was the same. Football people think they're the be all and the end all, and to a large extent they are, but they're not. Practically the only people. So there's always going to be disputes. I've never met a manager yet, and I know lots of managers that was never three. Every manager's always 3 players short. Doesn't matter who he is, and they always wants to overpay the players, and always want to give in to the players. And this was always going on at Celtic. At the end of the day, we're not going to rescue a bust company just to make it bust again. So there was always conflict. Wim Jansen, Hugh Keevins is famous for announcing it's Jorge, some Portuguese dude, I've forgotten his name. Arthur George.
That's right, yeah.
Front page or back page news, it's Arthur George. And everybody's waiting for Arthur George to come through that wee door in the Celtic boardroom. And this is a true story. And then the door opens and this wee curly-haired guy comes in, and some guy from the Sun goes, "Christ, it's Robert Pritz has got the Celtic job." Now, a lot of people, if you're old enough, you'll know who Robert Pritz is. Yep. He was a wee curly guy with curly hair, played for Rangers, number 10, Swedish. So it was he was there or thereabouts. Goose or Hoos Hiddink was in and around the scene. But it's a matter of record that Dermot Desmond didn't see the fire in his eyes. He never got the gig. But I'm gone by 2001, so I don't know what's happened ever since. I do know the situation. I think I'm allowed to say this, and I won't impersonate Fergus, but Kenny Dalglish, the combo Kenny Dalglish, John Barnes, that would never have happened in a million years if Fergus McCann had been there. And it was almost like, don't appoint these guys or that guy. And it's like, you going, Fergus? And Kenny Dalglish is through the other door. Kenny Dalglish, great guy, great Celtic player. I think he lost the fire in his belly by then, and appointing a rookie manager. It's the same with Gerrard. I mean, he was the best player in the world and the worst manager in the world, and Barnes never had it, and he never went on to do anything.
No.
Briefly managed MK Dons, briefly managed Tranmere, and he just didn't have it. Nothing wrong with that. Rookie managers are a bad idea, as Rangers have found out.
Every time Celtic have done it, other than Neil Lennon, I think it's been a bad idea, with Liam Brady and, of course, John Barnes, the aforementioned. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I had a wee chat with John a few weeks ago and it was quite controversial. So I'm glad you've brought that up yourself, David. The whole purpose of today's discussion was to talk about the Celtic Trust and your involvement with the shareholders in relation to the dividends that obviously we've spoken about twice now. We'll be speaking about it again, but in summary, for anyone who is watching or may watch this on YouTube later on once it's been uploaded, in summary, what is the message to Celtic shareholders today?
If you're not sure, if a shareholder's not sure whether he still got shares or owns shares, he should join the Celtic Trust, and we will check the share register and tell them how to go about re-engaging with their shares. It can be quite intimidating. Again, this is for the ivory tower principle. Everybody assumes in the boardroom, or most boardrooms, they're not talking the Celtic ones, that, oh, you just do this or you just do that. But if you've never done it before, it's not quite as simple as that. It's a bit of a maze. But the Celtic Trust can reunite Celtic shareholders with their shares. It can also reunite Celtic shareholders with their dividends. Most Celtic shareholders bought their shares in 1994. They get two types of shares: ordinary shares, which allow you to vote and attend AGMs, and a thing called preference shares, which pay a 3.6p dividend. The most common shareholding was the smallest one. It was 500 of these shares. So that's an £18 a year dividend. Now, there's some of these shares still sitting in the company registrar's bank account. 24 years. They paid dividends since 1997. 24 years, up to 24 years of shareholders' dividends are sitting in the share register's bank account waiting for the shareholder to get it. And that's 400 quid. So if you've moved home and not updated your share register up to 24 years of dividend, 400 quid is sitting in a bank account waiting for you. Less years is less money, but once you have re-registered your shares, you've updated your address, they'll send you the money. Mm-hmm. And you remember your shares are worth 1,200 quid as well. So you want to know, you want to be in touch with that shareholding. So we can help you. The Celtic Trust can help you reunite with your shares. The numbers since we've relaunched this are large, though, and we're having to prioritise Celtic Trust members because there's just so many. So join the Celtic Trust, be at the top of the queue.
Now, David, I really appreciate you coming along to our studio here at State of Mind. I hope you enjoy the palatial surroundings that you were met by when you walked through the door. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about Celtic and business, and you are welcome back anytime to put any message to the Celtic support or shareholders group. So thank you very much for joining us on A Celtic State of Mind.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.